Grüß, willkommen in einem aufregendes video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 15 of my organisational series. In this video I'll be providing a view of the UK World War II Division's combat strengths and the changes in strength which occurred during the war. For this video I'll be using the point system from the Corps Commander set of rules. This point system is based largely on physical attributes of the various weapon systems such as armour thickness, gun penetration rates, rate of fire, speed, special combat features and so on. Viewers need to understand that 100 points of tanks will operate very differently from 100 points of infantry, thus comparing tank battalions with infantry battalions need to be done through a subjective filter. However, comparing a tank battalion in 1942 with one in 1945 is valid. While I am using the Corps Commander point system, I'll be dividing all the values by 250. It must be remembered that while figure gaming points provides a rough way of ensuring points or force mixes are balanced, they can never be perfect. If one formation is 1000 points and the other is 1001 points, it does not mean the latter will win any conflict. As a result, it's best to look at this value as several orders of magnitude higher, thus dividing by 250 gives you a simpler value where you know a value of 2 is clearly inferior to a value of 3. I have to admit this video is rather long, which is what you get when there is a large amount of information concerning the TO&E changes the British conducted during the war. Many of the changes are rather minor, but I was unable to determine which I should remove, so I've included them all for your entertainment. The initial UK involvement in World War II was Norway, or at least in Europe, which ranged between May and June 1940. This was then followed by the German invasion of France, which also occurred during the same period, May to June 1940. The main building block of the British Army was its infantry divisions, which at this point in time were fully motorised. The divisions which went to France were good, if not outstanding. The reconnaissance battalions gave this division's very good reconnaissance capability and a little bit of punch. The British were only just beginning their formation of armoured divisions. This was one of the first two armoured divisions organised in 1939, the 1st Armoured Division. This division never fought in this particular organisational form, but was the bedrock of all the divisions which came after. It was two armoured brigades with all the support formations in a support group. The Light Tank Battalion is so strong because it has so many tanks in it, over 100 tanks, of which half were MG or machine gun light tanks. This was an unusually powerful battalion for the period. We'll now look at the actual division that was fielded in France. The actual division which the British were forming in France was only formed and deployed after the Battle of Dunkirk. While never fully formed as it was intended, the British Armoured Division which fought in France was beginning to look like a standard armoured division. The motorised infantry battalions were rather powerful, being well equipped with support weapons. Shortly after the French campaign, the British were facing the Italians in Egypt between December 1940 and March 1941. The British tended to use infantry divisions from India, Australia and New Zealand in the Middle East, this being an Indian division, the 4th Indian. There were some changes to the standard infantry division structure, with the machine gun battalion formally added to the division and an anti-aircraft battalion added as well. The reconnaissance battalion was slightly larger as well in this case, which in theory gave it a good punch. The other armoured division the UK formed in 1939 was based in Egypt. It differed from the division in the UK based on what formations were available in the Middle East. This armoured division lacked an engineer and anti-aircraft battalion, and the infantry battalion was not as strong, but was otherwise similar to the division formed in the UK in the same period. When the British actually launched their offensive, the 7th Armoured Division had been beefed up. For Wavell's offensive, the engineer and anti-aircraft battalion was added, as well as an armoured car battalion. The infantry was beefed up, and a motor infantry battalion was added to the armoured brigade. The tank battalion was also increased in strength. After the initial victory against the Italians, the British had sent troops elsewhere, which was when Rommel struck. This ranged from between March 41 and April 41. The troops that were sent elsewhere went to Greece, where they fought well but had little chance of survival. In this particular case, they fought between April 41 and May 1941. Back in North Africa, the British began their counter-offensive, starting with brevity and battle axe, which failed to force the Germans back. Finally, in November 1941, the British launched Crusader, which did force the Germans back to their start position. The British did begin sending UK-based infantry divisions to Africa, this being one of them, the 2nd Infantry Division. In this division, the British had increased the strength of the divisional support formations, but did remove the reconnaissance battalion. One of the British elite divisions in North Africa were the Australians. The Australian division did not change as much compared with UK divisions, not possessing divisional support and retaining its armoured car reconnaissance battalion. It should be noted that while the Australians did follow the UK general structure of their formations, there were some differences, such as they didn't really have a regimental system as the British possessed. Whenever the British made changes to their official structure for any division, it was numbered using Roman numerals, this being the 3rd official change since the beginning of the war, Organisation 3. The only change to the Org 3 structure was the addition of infantry support formations and the beefing up of the motor rifle battalion, which was part of the armoured brigades. After the British successes, they once again removed formations and the Germans came back once again.
After Rommel's offensive, this was then followed up by what is probably the largest and most intense battle in Africa up to this date, the Battle of Gazala. This ranged from between May 42 to July 1942.
In this case, this division was structured in the manner of Org 2, so it moved back to the old structure. However, it was a Middle Eastern division. The divisions in the desert did differ from those held back in the UK often. As with the Org 2 structure, the division's divisional support was smaller, but it did possess the armoured car reconnaissance battalion in this particular case. A major issue the British had in the desert was their inability to operate as a division in a combined arms form. This structure may have been used because the British separated their brigades. Early in 1942, the Armoured Division did experience some major changes. In this case, it's what's called the Org 4 changes. This was probably due to assets being removed for operations in Syria. In this Org change, the British increased their artillery but removed their anti-tank and anti-aircraft battalion. The motor infantry battalions in the armoured brigades lost some formations. By May, the armoured divisions were back up to their normal structure and strength. In this case, this was the Org 5 of the armoured division. In this structure, while the division lost an artillery battalion, they got their anti-tank and anti-aircraft battalion back. The motor rifle battalions in the armoured brigades also regained their strength. The improved tanks also resulted in the armoured battalions increasing in strength. After the defeat at Gazala, the British fought a desperate defence at El Alamein and managed to prevail. This was then followed by the British counterattack and their hard-fought victory in October 1942. At the other end of North Africa, the British were involved in the invasion of Morocco and Algeria and their final move into Tunisia. This ranged between November 42 and December 42. In North Africa, the British were still using their Org 2 structure, but within the official structure, minor changes still did occur. This again was a Middle East version. In UK, the British had already moved on to other organisational structures. While there were some minor changes and fine-tuning, there was really no tangible changes in the structure of the infantry division at this particular scale compared to any of the previous Org Structure 2 Middle East divisions infantry. Seeing the big focus in this period was an experimental division in terms of trying to create a mechanised or mixed division. The New Zealand 2nd Mixed Division had 2 infantry brigades and an infantry armoured brigade. This was a short-lived experiment, so clearly it didn't work. During this period, the Armoured Division still used Org Structure 5. However, there was quite a few minor adjustments, mainly equipment strengths in some of the battalions and, of course, the equipment types. The artillery battalions were beefed up, as was a AA battalion. On the other hand, the infantry battalions in the infantry brigade lost some support equipment, but the motor infantry battalions in the armoured brigades gained additional supporting equipment, basically just readjusting the deck chairs, I would expect. The final campaign in Africa was the final conquest of Tunisia, which in this case raged between January 43 and May 1943. The infantry division in early 1943 had stabilised its structure as well as becoming highly experienced and able to operate as a division instead of independent brigades. They were still officially using the Org-2 structure. As any changes were quite minor, at this scale there was no changes or no visible changes to the infantry division. By January 1945 we were still at our 5th official armoured divisional org structure change or level. There were some equipment changes, however. While there were some equipment changes in this particular division, at this scale there was no visible change and the division was pretty much the same as previous. After the victory in Africa, the British were involved in the invasion of Sicily, raging between July 43 and August 1943. This was then followed up by the initial invasion of Italy proper, the first stage raging between September 43 and December 1943. After the victory in Africa, the British took this opportunity to make any minor changes and ensure the division, that is infantry division, was equipped with the latest equipment. A lot of older British equipment was left behind in Africa. In this particular case, the divisions were also restructured using the Org-3 structure, which was common or which had already been implemented in the UK but not yet in the Middle East. In this structure, the Armoured Car Reconnaissance Battalion was now organic to the division, and using new armoured cars, it gained in strength. Otherwise, the division remained much the same. The British did have available airborne forces for this campaign, which did perform some minor drops. The airborne battalions lacked a lot of heavy equipment and were weak as a result, even if highly skilled and motivated. The artillery battalion contained all the artillery, anti-tank guns and anti-aircraft guns, and was rather powerful as a result. However, this would have been distributed out to the individual infantry battalions in any actual action. As indicated, the British did revamp a lot of the equipment, and one of the things they did was they left behind a lot of their older British-made tanks and decided to standardise on a fewer number of more modern tanks, specifically the US M4 medium tank. For this structure, in this particular case the Org-6 structure, the Armoured Division adjusted some of the forces at divisional level, and with new anti-aircraft and anti-armoured car battalions was more powerful. Additional artillery was added and the anti-tank battalion became significantly more powerful due to the introduction of new ammunition and the 17-pounder. Even the anti-aircraft battalion gained in strength. The infantry battalion in the armoured brigades did lose some support equipment and manpower. In early 1944, the British were involved in heavy fighting in Italy. In this particular case, this raged from January 44 to June 44. Infantry divisions were still using Org Structure 3, and as a result there was no structural changes. However, new improved equipment was arriving, which did have an impact on the divisional's combat capability. The main change at this particular level was new equipment was arriving in the armoured car battalions, which increased its strength. It was becoming a reasonably powerful battalion strength formation. For the armoured divisions, it still used Structure 6, and as a result there were no structural changes. The British had identified their ideal armoured divisional structure at this particular point. While the structure had not changed, new equipment did have an impact. The tank battalions grew in strength due to the arrival of improved vehicles. In the second half of 1944, the British experienced their highest level of combat, starting with the iconic invasion of France. This period ranges between June 44 and August 44. Also in this period, the British were involved in a major push in Italy, which ranged from July 1944 to December 1944. Back in France and after the breakout, the British started driving up the coast to the Netherlands. This particular period ranged between August 44 and November 44. While the British were not initially involved in defending against the German counteroffensive, they did get involved in reducing the German bulge. In this case, this raged between December 44 and February 1945. When we look at the infantry division, we're still using Org-3. There were no serious structural changes occurring. The main change was new equipment continued arriving, and this did have a significant impact on the combat capability of a number of battalions, as you can see here. The British airborne troops were heavily engaged in France, containing or conducting 2 large airdrops. For this structure, the British increased the amount of supporting equipment in the division, airborne division, especially the paratrooper battalions. When we look at the Armoured Division, there were no major changes, but in terms of doctrine, there was a major change. The 7th Armoured Division adopted a combined arms structure in the fighting in France, and it was a significant success. I'm not sure if they got this from the Germans or the US Armoured Division, but soon after the other British Armoured Divisions adopted this doctrine. I suspect the first use of IFVs, or infantry fighting vehicles, may have been a contributing factor, but this is only a wild guess. There were some minor changes, and the main one was related to new equipment arriving, and this included the adoption of tank destroyer battalions, of which there were 2, and the arrival of new equipment which increased the strength of the armoured battalions, making them significantly powerful. We now move on to the end of the war. The British were involved in the reduction of the German bulge after the German offensive, December to February 1945. The bulk of the fighting which occurred in the latter part of the war was the fighting in France and in Germany as the British drove up towards the Danish border and Hamburg. In Italy, the British were involved in the final heavy fighting as the Allies managed to take most of Italy by May 1945. There were no structural organisational changes, but by 1945 the British infantry divisions were veteran formations, even if a bit cautious in some cases. At this level there were no structural changes, but the anti-tank battalion continued to grow in strength as the proportion of 17-pounders grew and as the new APDS round was being introduced in numbers. For the latter part of the war, the British introduced their org structure H. However, at this level, that didn't really have much impact, so there were no visible org structure, but the armoured divisions were certainly veteran and adept in the use of combined arms tactics at this point in the war, making them highly effective armoured divisions. There were no TO&E or visible TO&E changes, but by the end of the fighting in Europe, the British were receiving some excellent weapons, specifically the Comet medium tank. All this increased an increase in combat effectiveness of their armoured battalions. That goes through all the divisions in detail. Let's now look at how these formations changed over the period of the war. The British infantry divisions up to June 1943 experienced some changes. The biggest was the addition and subtraction of various support formations. Apart from that, the anti-tank battalion grew in strength, mainly due to improved guns and ammunition. Apart from the initial infantry battalion strength remained reasonably stable for the entire war period. From July 1943 to the end of the war, we see significant increases in strength of the Armoured Car Reconnaissance Battalion due to improved vehicles, and the Anti-Tank Battalion. Due mainly to improved guns and ammunition, the Anti-Aircraft Battalion increased in strength in 1944, but dropped back when the threat from German aircraft was less. Let's now look at the Armoured Division. Ignoring the variable state of the support formations, the main changes was the removal of the very large light tank battalion from the 1939-40 structure and the adoption of 2 armoured brigades. The armoured brigades also gained a motor infantry battalion, which was reasonably powerful and grew in strength as equipment improved. The tank battalion also improved in strength as equipment improved. The infantry battalions, tended to fluctuate in strength as support formations were removed and added. The armoured car and anti-tank battalions grew in strength as equipment improved. For the second half of the war, the same trends are visible. Reconnaissance battalion growing in strength as equipment improved. The anti-tank gun battalion dropped in strength, but only because part of the formation was replaced with tank destroyer battalions, which are separate formations. When the British received the Comet, the tank battalions became very powerful indeed. In summary, if we ignore the various support formations, the structure remained reasonably stable with some battalion strengths improving as better and more advanced equipment was being adopted. But I must admit the British did like to tinker, which is why they possess so many official armoured division organisations, even though each change seemed to be so minor, apart from the first few changes. So this concludes episode 15 of my video series on organisation, in this case analysing the UK Army in World War II, specifically the estimated combat strength of the battalions, which made up the divisions as well as how they changed during the war. Alle guten Dinge, kommen zu einem Ende.